I like to create texture quilts for new babies, full of all sorts of different fabrics for the baby to explore and lots of ribbons for the baby to grab onto. Creating one of these usually means a trip to Joann's to pick up quarter yards of specialty fabric. However, Joann's is vanishing, and I have yet to find a replacement for finding these sorts of fabrics in small quantities. So, in this most recent one that I've created, this satin and the minky and the velour and the terry cloth are all from my stash. But my stash won't last forever, so I've started thinking about alternative ways to create interesting textures in a quilt. In this quilt, I added this heart in the middle by creating some chenille. This was my first experience with this technique and I just winged it. But I was intrigued and decided to go down a rabbit hole. I poked around a little bit here on YouTube and watched a few tutorials and noticed that in each one, the chenille was cut on the bias. Since some of the ideas popping around in my head aren't really bias friendly, I decided to see if there was a reason for this and decided to test out some alternatives. I made a test panel with flannel and with quilting cotton with channels sewn and cut on the bias, on the lengthwise grain, and on the crosswise grain. And then I sent it through the wash. I had expected that there would be some longer threads coming off the two straight grain examples, but I was surprised at how obviously lacking the bias cut was in stray threads. The other notable difference, to me at least, was that there's much more wiggle back and forth in these, the bias squares, as opposed to the ones that were cut on the straight grain. This one here especially seems a lot straighter. These seem to have a lot more wiggles. And I had a little duh moment because I know about properties of the bias edge and somehow I hadn't thought to apply them to this situation. Sometimes I really need to see things in order to get my brain working. There are two properties of a bias edge that make cutting chenille on the bias a really good way to do it. The bias edge does not ravel the same way as a grain edge does. On grain edges, you can just pull crossing threads out. You're effectively unweaving the fabric. This is what we do on purpose when we're making rag quilts. The crosswise threads come out very easily, just like that, and they come out a little more every time we wash it. This one's only been washed once, so not much is coming out yet, but it's easy to pull these out. We clip these edges so we don't get these long threads that tangle when we wash it. On the bias edge, the threads run diagonally, just like on the pattern on this fabric. The threads are running like this. So if you were to try to pull one, it would be interlocked way back here. You couldn't just pull it off the edge. The bias edge does have a little fuzz, but it doesn't unravel with big long strings, and it's not really going to unravel more than what it is right here, right now. This is actually why quilt bindings made on the bias like this one are considered a little more durable. If one thread wears out along the fold here, the whole edge won't fall apart. Another property of a bias edge is that it stretches. Fabric doesn't stretch much on the lengthwise and crosswise grains, but it does stretch on the bias. If I pull on a bias edge like this one, it will stretch out. You can see now that this got stretched out and is longer than the one that I haven't stretched. Although there are some wiggles on the lengthwise and crosswise chenille cuts, I think there are many more wiggles on the bias cut. And that's because this edge can stretch more than the seam below it, and that extra length has to go somewhere, so it has to wiggle. I think these wiggles add a lot to both the design of the chenille and also the coverage of the chenille over the background fabric. This heart that I made on this quilt on the fly was likely not cut on the bias, and you can see that there's sort of channels in between each piece instead of being more evenly wiggling over the whole surface. And now I know why. I hope my little experiment gives you some ideas about how you might want to incorporate chenille best into your next project. Happy sewing!